Hi, I'm Bill Alexander, CEO of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. I am pleased to welcome you to today's program, Tragedy and Transformation, Law Enforcement Response to Hate Crime Events, which is generously sponsored by Target. In tonight's program, our panelists will examine the law enforcement responses to two tragic events in LGBTQ plus history: the upstairs lounge fire in 1973 and the Pulse Nightclub shooting in 2016. While both events were devastating, they differ drastically in context, response, and impact. Today, our panelists will discuss the similarities and differences in emergency response and community impact of these two events. Additionally, they will discuss the evolving role of law enforcement in ensuring LGBTQ plus safety in our communities. Before I turn it over to our panelists, I would like to give the floor to tonight's sponsor, Target, to say a few words.
Hi, I'm Gary Smith, Senior Director of Assets Protection at Target. Pride Month is here, and Target is celebrating and supporting LGBTQIA plus team members, guests, suppliers, and communities by recognizing their unique, diverse experiences and contributions to our business and culture all year long. As we have for many years, we continue to mark the moment by offering guests an assortment of celebratory products, hosting a lineup of events for our teams throughout the month of June, and supporting local events in neighborhoods across the country. Across Target, we work to foster inclusivity and a sense of connection for all team members, guests, communities, in our aisles, at supply chain facilities, at headquarters, and beyond. On behalf of Target, I would like to thank our law enforcement partners for your commitment to leadership and public service, and for helping Target keep our guests, team members, and communities safe.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Muckenfoos, and I'm the Director of Programs at the National Law Enforcement Museum. I'm going to be moderating today's program, Tragedy and Transformation, Law Enforcement Response to Hate Crime Events, which is generously sponsored by Target. Today, we're here to hold an important panel discussion and critical examination of law enforcement responses to two tragic events in LGBTQ plus history: the upstairs lounge fire of 1973 and the Pulse Nightclub shooting of 2016. While both of these events were devastating, they differ significantly in context, response, and impact. Through expert analysis and firsthand accounts, we're going to explore the similarities and differences in emergency response, community impact, and the evolving role of law enforcement in ensuring LGBTQ plus safety, including improved protocols, enhanced training, engagement, and mental health resources. So I'd like to welcome our panelists and welcome all of you who are watching today. Before we get into our discussion, I'm going to give each of my panelists a chance to introduce themselves. And we're going to start with Frank.
Hi, my name is Frank Perez. I serve as the Executive Director of the LGBT Plus Archives Project of Louisiana, which is a nonprofit that works to preserve queer history. I'm also a writer. I've written a few books on the history of New Orleans. Good to be here.
We're happy to have you. And Robert, go ahead. You can introduce yourself next.
Sure. So my name is Robert Bobby Fiesler. I am a New Orleans-based journalist who covers marginalized groups and also a scholar who excavates forgotten histories with a special focus on the queer South. I'm the author of the book Tinderbox, The Untold Story of the Upstairs Lounge Fire and the Rise of Gay Liberation, which was my debut book and kicked off a 7-year journey that ultimately led to me at the New Orleans City Council chamber, giving an hour-long presentation to the council, and eventually the council unanimously apologized and gave a resolution that named all the upstairs lounge fires victims' names. And I'm also the author of a forthcoming book on queer Florida called American Scare: Florida's Hidden Cold War on Black and Queer Lives. And I know Frank also wants me to mention that I'm a proud board member of the LGBT Archives Project of Louisiana, and I'm very happy to be here.
Absolutely, we're happy to have you. And then next we've got Pete.
Yes, hey, good to be here. Pete Roselli. I did 15 years with the New York City Police Department and then left the NYPD to go to ATF. I spent 20 years with ATF, ending my career as the head of training there. I was a whistleblower during the Operation Fast and Furious scandal, and I too have published a book called The Deadly Path: How Operation Fast and Furious and Bad Lawyers Armed Mexican Cartels. So happy to be here.
Awesome. And we're very happy to have all three of you here today. I think this is going to be a really great discussion. And before we really get started and dive deeper into these events, I think it's really good for us to give our audience some context on these two events. We have the Upstairs Lounge fire, which occurred in New Orleans in 1973, and then the Pulse Nightclub shooting, which took place in Orlando, Florida in 2016. And we're going to go in chronological order because I think that's the easiest way for all of us to really get the most out of this discussion. So Frank, could you give us some background on the general opinion toward the gay community in New Orleans in the mid-20th century leading up to the Upstairs Lounge fire in 1973?
Sure. Well, this may surprise some people because New Orleans today is very inclusive and tolerant and queer friendly, but it wasn't always that way. In fact, the city was pretty hostile to the queer community in the 1950s. The mayor actually appointed a committee called the Committee on the Problem of Sex Deviants, and their whole mission was to rid the French Quarter of homosexuals. Hint, didn't work. But the city was pretty adamant at raiding gay bars and just really squashing any kind of queer visibility. There are a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which was the emergence of the tourism industry. And the feeling back then among the political establishment and the business establishment was that queer visibility would scare away tourist dollars. And so the city was pretty intolerant and downright cruel to the community for a long time. That begins to change in the 1980s through the efforts of political action groups and the phenomenal success of a Labor Day weekend extravaganza known as Southern Decadence, which brings over 200,000 gay men mostly to the city every summer. And they spend a lot of money. So money doesn't necessarily buy acceptance, but it will definitely buy a lot of tolerance. But in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the city was pretty hostile toward the queer community, and that was reflected in policing.
Absolutely. And kind of before we go over and talk about Pulse, let's talk a little bit about how the Upstairs Lounge fits into this narrative. So tell us a little bit about the Upstairs Lounge and what it was, what type of a place it was.
Is that for me or Bobby?
We'll start with you, but Bobby can also fill in any gaps if we have any.
Sure. So the Upstairs Lounge was a neighborhood gay bar in the French Quarter, one of several. It was primarily catered to a working class crowd. It was sort of unusual in that it was one of the few bars that did not discriminate on the basis of race or sexual orientation, which made it kind of unique in New Orleans at that time. And it was just an incredibly friendly neighborhood bar with a lot of regular locals. It actually hosted the Metropolitan Community Church, which is a gay affirming denomination. They used to have services there, and it was just best way to describe it would be a neighborhood bar filled with regulars. Everybody knew each other, and that was the environment. Bobby may want to add something.
Sure. In that into that special sort of environment that actually can serve as a forerunner to a lot of modern queer safe spaces when you think about it, because they're not discriminating on basis of gender, they're not discriminating on basis of race. There's a sort of queer religion that's part of it. There was even a playhouse in the back, so it was this multi-purpose community gathering space that was almost like a gay Cheers, as Frank and I. But on the night, all that came to a head and came crashing on the night of June 24th, 1973, which was a particularly hot Sunday evening in the midst of what in some places around the country was being celebrated as Pride Month. In New Orleans, there was no knowledge of Pride or any gay politics. It was just another June. the last Sunday in June. And basically what happened on the night of June 24th, 1973 became known in historic epochs as basically a notoriously unsolved arson fire that hit the bar on its busiest night of the week, right around when right around when a very popular drink special was occurring, and when there would have been peak crowds. And this arson fire it's largely understood to have been lit by, in most likely cases, by a disaffected gay for pay sex worker named Roger Dale Nunez, who was ejected from the upstairs lounge bar, which led to a person matching his description going to a nearby Walgreens and buying a certain size and brand of lighter fluid, and then a person bearing that size and brand of lighter fluid emptying it into the front staircase of the upstairs lounge, which had served as a sole entrance and exit. It was a second floor bar accessed by one staircase. A spark was produced, and then chaos ensued. What resulted was the deaths of 32 individuals in less than 3 minutes time, and countless others injured, and the community was left reeling, unsure in many cases of how to deal with this literally explosive emergency moment that hit this a very underground community in New Orleans at that point. So I think that's a good, and Frank, and you can hop in here too, but I think that's a good stage setting for the understanding the upstairs lounge.
Yes, I would agree.
And kind of as you mentioned, especially, which seems rather common, especially in the South in the 1970s, the investigation into the upstairs lounge, it was kind of an unsolved arson investigation, and really with no resolution. But that was not the case by the time we get to 2016, and we have the tragedy at the Pulse Nightclub in Orlando, Florida. So Pete, why don't you kind of give us a little glimpse into what that investigation looked like? So could you give us a general overview of how law enforcement was prepared in the 2010s to respond to an incident such as the Pulse Nightclub shooting, particularly through the lens of a terrorist incident against a marginalized group?
Sure. In fact, the Pulse Nightclub shooting was the second largest terror attack in the U.S. It was only outdone by 9/11. So it was on June 12th, 2016. So the anniversary would be 10 days from today. Omar Mateen went into the Pulse Nightclub and killed 49 people and injured 53 others. There was a 3-hour standoff that took place when the police responded. Eventually, they entered and shot and killed Mateen. And then as the investigation ensued, it was determined that he was pledging allegiance to ISIS and posting things on social media that showed he had been radicalized, and that he had acquired the firearms through a lawful firearms purchase shortly before the incident. Interestingly, he was an armed guard that worked for G4S Solutions, which did a lot of work protecting courthouses, protecting private correctional facilities. But he was killed in the 3-hour standoff. So there were a lot of questions about why didn't the police go in there sooner? But when you compare it to other incidents, I mean, it's not unusual. Like when you look at the recent shooting in Uvalde, Texas, where police stage outside and wait to enter because they're afraid that if they try to gain entry, they could increase the rate in which people are killed. So there were a lot of questions about it. And there were also some questions because of the FBI's awareness of Mateen's posting on social media. They had interviewed him and felt that he wasn't a threat. And then here in this incident, like I said, he goes on and commits what is the second largest terror attack in U.S. history.
Absolutely. And I think it's notable to mention up until the Pulse Nightclub shooting, the upstairs lounge, which Bobby mentions in his book, the upstairs lounge was, or I guess you could explain it probably better than I can.
Yeah.
And
so the upstairs lounge fire
yeah.
up to that point was the deadliest fire on record in New Orleans history, and it was the worst mass killing of homosexuals in U.S. history until the 2016 massacre at Pulse. And in the aftermath of the Pulse Nightclub shooting, the sort of public knowledge of and the legacy of the upstairs lounge fire from 1973 increased in the most surprising and unplanned way. The nightclub shooting at Pulse and the fire at the arson at the upstairs lounge, they bear this strange and surprising emotional relationship in people's minds. I mean, I guess it's kind of natural. It's the deadliest event and the second deadliest event to strike the American queer community. And then the public reactions to the two tragedies, nonchalance or confusion or awkwardness resulting in the upstairs lounge versus sorrow, outrage, rapid police response for Pulse, it provided this contrast that I think for many people spoke to the journey that queer Americans had towards visible citizenship and the attainment of civil rights in the 43 years between 1973 and 2016. And so basically that's the entire queer rights push for the queer rights movement is in that gap of years. And so you see two instances of one event where queer folk are considered victims of a violent event. The individual who harms them is considered a criminal and is pursued by law enforcement. And then another event where queer Americans in 1973 are considered un-American criminal suspects. And the person who commits the arson is not really of interest to local law enforcement, to the point where they have him even in custody for questioning at various times and refuse to question him. And so what was really moving for me, I was writing Tinderbox when the Pulse nightclub shooting happened in Orlando. And what I saw so up close and intensely was that survivors and witnesses of the upstairs lounge fire, many of them were so traumatized that up until 2016, they hadn't really shared many of their stories. And a lot of those individuals who were on the fence about even talking to an author like me for a book, or a journalist who came calling, suddenly called someone like me with urgency, and they had to tell the story. In many cases for the first time. And I found that to be so powerful. One of the upstairs lounge victims said he saw in that moment with Pulse a reason and a place to not waste his suffering, to make it mean something and worth it. And in this act of generosity and empathy, he reached out and offered this story in the hopes of providing any kind of solidarity, compassion, succor to the individuals who had just underwent and experienced probably the most traumatic, inexplicable moment in their entire lives. Undoubtedly, I mean, Mateen's field of slaughter was almost unimaginable from even our context, talking about it on a Zoom. And so there was a sense of solidarity almost instantly between those who survived or were affected by the upstairs lounge fire in New Orleans and their efforts of outreach to Orlando and to the survivors and victims and families of Pulse that I found very powerful and very meaningful.
Absolutely. And you really kind of covered my last question that I had, kind of bringing together, kind of elaborating on the comparison between Pulse nightclub and the upstairs lounge fire. So I'm going to get into my first real question about really focusing on our examination of the upstairs lounge fire here. So Robert, your book really dives into the politics of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana at the time of the upstairs lounge fire. Was the lack of community support of the gay community something that may have limited law enforcement's response to the upstairs lounge fire?
Well, by and large, the community wasn't putting pressure on law enforcement to solve the arson or to provide answers. Although in the immediate minutes after the upstairs lounge fire, the New Orleans Fire Department very bravely and expeditiously put out a fire that could have consumed the entire near downtown area and the French Quarter. It at least risked to. But in the hours and days that followed, there was a lack of community interest and perhaps almost even a phobia or fear of continuing to talk about the upstairs lounge arson. Once it became known and once it became publicly identified in the newspapers that the upstairs lounge bar had served a homosexual patronage community. And so additionally, there wasn't a community placing pressure on politicians. The mayor of New Orleans, Moon Landrieu, who was a progressive Southern Democrat, who was in many ways a pioneer in the realm of civil rights causes in terms of race, was out of town at the time the upstairs lounge fire happened and elected to remain out of town for weeks afterwards, rather than come back and face the brunt of what he and many others in the administration considered a political hot potato. So there's no political pressure either. Therefore, you have a set of detectives, officers, one named Schlosser, the other named Jebbia, who had no training in investigating crimes within what they considered to be a criminal class in New Orleans. And so when they're investigating the upstairs lounge fire, you can tell they're interrogating witnesses who are oftentimes scared to even admit they were in the bar or what they were doing there for fear themselves of being convicted of a homosexual crime. And you could tell even in the police report, they're trying to note they'll throw the word homosexual around whenever they spot something like this was a homosexual church. This is where some of those homosexuals gathered. You couldn't tell whether or not they were about to do a citywide purge of the queer community, or if they were actually looking for someone who'd set a fire that killed someone at this bar. And so that ultimately led to, especially when you're not having media interest, you're not having political interest, and there's not community outcry to solve something, eventually what happens is the police force finds ways and reasons to, pardon my French, cover their ass with paperwork and move on to other causes. And so by July, you have almost no progress in the upstairs lounge investigation. They had not even questioned the chief suspect, the sex worker Roger Dale Nunez, who had been ejected from the upstairs lounge bar minutes before the fire began, screaming the words, quote, "I'm going to burn you all out." Quote, "I'm going to burn you all out." Folks, that's what you call motive, anger. And so, and eventually the police report was closed by the end of August, without even any declaration that the fire had been an arson or intentionally set. They called it a fire of undetermined origin, and they said they'll issue a supplementary report if and when they find and are able to question the chief suspect, which somehow they were never able to do. And so Roger Dale Nunez, eventually, who fled the city post upstairs lounge fire, eventually found excuse and reason to come back into town, where he continued to cause trouble. And then eventually he was a mentally disturbed individual who died by suicide in 1974. And so by the time that he unable to be questioned by anyone. And so that closed down the possibility of the upstairs lounge tragedy ever having appended to it an official answer, which would have been significant for the families and survivors who were seeking, in many cases, pursuing civil litigation against the city for unsafe bar practices and habits, unsatisfactory fire inspections at the bar, etc. In addition to the cause of criminal justice, which could have yielded some significant and honestly not very difficult to find answers that would have resulted in the upstairs lounge fire not being treated, at least in official capacity, as the historic mystery that it's treated now. And so you got me going, but like, the lack of I would call it not just support, but pressure meant that law enforcement weren't really expected to do much other than shuffle papers, interview a few people, and then and they were then allowed to close basically the case of the deadliest fire in their city history without even naming a suspect or having any answers, and that was considered satisfactory.
And Frank, did you have anything?
That's hard to follow. I mean, Bobby pretty much covered it. I will point out that there were even some people within the LGBT community who really didn't want a lot of attention. I think Bobby would agree that there were certain segments of the queer community, some of the gay bar owners, for example, did not want all this unsolicited attention. And so, in many respects, to their discredit, a lot of gay men just kept quiet, and there was just no pressure whatsoever to solve the case.
And that has a lot to do with, in New Orleans, especially this gay business elites and the gay bar owners, such as the owner of the upstairs lounge, Phil Steve, who were demanding that people not politicize the bar tragedy, that they not utilize it as this mechanism to raise visibility of what had been up to that point a very discreet and concealed community. And really stood in the ruin. Phil Steve stood in the ruins of his own bar and basically asked activists who could have put pressure on the police to go away. So that's a lot of that is a statement of these are all statements of the times about and the status of where things were on the spectrum, not just of acceptance but visibility, and what that means for people who are part of a hidden community, who face a true emergency moment where they need official resources to swoop in, to come to bear. And unfortunately, in the wake of the upstairs lounge tragedy in 1973, what you see from a law enforcement perspective, from many perspectives, all civil and even religious institutions fail this group of victims and survivors.
Definitely. And I think this is kind of a good segue into kind of asking Peter to provide kind of this law enforcement, kind of a look at this through the law enforcement lens. After hearing Robert's response to the last question, Peter, what's your perspective on the importance of the community's role in shaping the priorities of law enforcement?
Well, they were certainly dysfunctional, when you go back several decades. In some parts of the country, they still are. I mean, I don't know that everywhere there's this degree of acceptance that you have in some places. I can tell you in South Florida, for example, I was in charge of the Miami office of ATF when Pulse happened. And because Omar Mateen lived in our area, we were tasked with investigating how he acquired the weapons. There was open acceptance of the gay community in many parts of South Florida. I can tell you that, for example, in Orlando, it was all hands on deck and people wanted justice for the victims and they didn't care what their background was. And the gay community was openly accepted in that area. In fact, the woman who ran the Tampa field division, which oversaw the crime scene of the Pulse Nightclub shooting, was an outspoken gay woman. So, there was a degree of acceptance in her. She took that shooting to heart because in some ways she felt it was an attack on her personally, which I understood. But, when I went through the police academy in New York City, which is going back to January 1987, yeah, I'm old, we received extensive training, and not just on the gay community, but other communities as well, marginalized communities. And what a lot of people don't know, for example, the NYPD Academy is broken down into 4 different parts, one of which is physical fitness and shooting. The other is law, police science, which is the procedures and whatnot. And then finally, sociology. I mean, we got a quarter of our training was sociology, dealing with people from different communities, understanding where they come from. And it wasn't just the gay community, it was the Jewish community, which, as we know, was just yesterday subjected to an attack in the Boulder area. So, and I think a lot of other departments have done the same thing. So when you look at what happened back in the 1960s and 70s, and you compare it to today, it's vastly different. Now, is there still room to make further progress? Yeah, absolutely. But I remember as a rookie cop, I worked with officers there were 3 gay men that worked in my precinct. They changed in the locker room with us. They were accepted. There was never any feeling of animosity towards them. One of them was a supervisor, and there were probably twice as many gay females that I worked with. And again, they were accepted. Now, were they accepted in the NYPD going back to the 1960s and 70s? I hear they weren't. So again, it's progress that was made up until then to now, and I think we'll continue to see progress. But I mean, look, it's hard to deal with people who hate. And unfortunately, amongst us in the world, there are people who hate for a variety of reasons. Sexuality, obviously, big one. We see politics has gotten people fired up in some other areas. So I think until we start to see people being more accepting of their fellow human being, we'll unfortunately see more incidents like these, and it's tragic.
It really is. And Frank, I want to talk about a little bit about the city of New Orleans in the wake of the Upstairs Lounge fire. How did this event affect both the gay community and the broader community of New Orleans? Because even though the clientele of the Upstairs Lounge was members of the gay community, this fire happened in an area where everyone goes in New Orleans. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, one of the things the fire did was it motivated the local newspaper, the Times-Picayune, to run a series of 5, I think, articles, the first of which was titled Gay Underground Community Surfaces in Wake of Fire, or something to that effect. And so that was a few months after the fire. For the most part, there was not a whole lot of activism that resulted from the fire. Some people have tried to compare it to Stonewall, but that's not a very good comparison. There were a few attempts at organizing after the fire, but they were very short-lived and not sustainable. The community really, political organizing in the community really came to the forefront in 1977. There had been a few efforts in the early 70s, but again, they were short-lived. But in 1977, Anita Bryant came to town, and I don't know if everybody remembers her, but she was this homophobic crusader. And her appearance in New Orleans galvanized the local community to organize protests, and it was the largest demonstration on behalf of queer rights in the city's history, the state's history, actually, in 1977. And then there was also a political action group called LAGPAC, the Louisiana Lesbian and Gay Political Action Caucus, that was formed in 1980, that worked really hard, very deliberately, to develop relationships with the police and train them. Not train is too formal a word, but to educate them about the queer community. One example of that is they would organize softball games with members of the queer community and police officers, just so they could get to know each other. And so that the attitudes really began to shift in the 80s, but really the major paradigm shift occurred in the early 1990s.
And so I want to shift now. We're going to get into the comparison of kind of the Upstairs Lounge and the Pulse Nightclub shooting in just a little bit. But I do want to go and look at the Pulse Nightclub shooting, its response, and kind of, I don't necessarily want to say what was done right, but kind of looking at, as we look at what we just talked about with the Upstairs Lounge fire and the lack of response to the Pulse Nightclub shooting and the fact that there was such a substantial response. I really want to look at that. And Peter, you were part of kind of that investigation on ATF's end. So obviously you came onto the scene after Omar Mateen had been killed by law enforcement after that 3-hour standoff. But you were a significant, or your team was a significant part of that investigation. So could you tell us a little bit about the immediate law enforcement response to the Pulse shooting? And at what point in the investigation did the ATF get involved?
Sure. We were notified, well, as it was going on, because it came across as a mass shooting, and ATF frequently responds to those to provide assistance. Generally speaking, with most mass shootings, we're not the lead agency because it's either going to be a local homicide case, or in some instances where it's determined to be terror, a federal case that's going to be run by the FBI. So with the Pulse Nightclub shooting, again, I was not from the field division where the incident occurred, but I was asked to respond nonetheless. So we had 2 field divisions, the Miami Field Division and the Tampa Field Division, which covers all of Florida and the Caribbean, all hands on deck. So, and that's in addition to the Orlando Police Department, other local police departments nearby that had SWAT teams that deployed to help control the situation. Obviously, the FBI, which took control of the investigation once they determined it to be a terror incident. So, I mean, that's a massive response. And that doesn't even include FBI's evidence collection team, which is large, or the people from ATF and FBI headquarters that were later asked to contribute in some way, shape, or form. For example, our National Tracing Center, which is located in Martinsburg, West Virginia, did an urgent trace to be able to find out where Omar Mateen had acquired those firearms. And then we dispatched agents to that dealer to find out when he purchased them, if there was anything suspicious. The dealer was incredibly cooperative. And again, Omar Mateen was not a convicted felon. He wasn't an illegal alien, so he could lawfully buy a gun. The tragic part was he was at one point investigated by the FBI for suspicion, of being at least sympathetic to a terror group. But that sort of information is not queryable when they do these background checks, which are also done by the FBI, by the way. So, I mean, it was all hands on deck. And then the other thing is there was a revolver, because Omar Mateen had two very expensive firearms that he used for the shootings. But when they found his vehicle, there was a revolver in the car. So it was kind of interesting because they tried to trace it, but the gun was not traceable. And we found out the reason why. The gun had been actually given to Mateen by G4S Solutions in his position as an armed guard. But G4S Solutions was originally a company called Wackenhut, and they had purchased the gun before the Gun Control Act of 1968 was enacted. So, so therefore the gun wasn't registered because there was no need for them to fill out the forms, because back in the day, those forms didn't exist. But we were able to go find out by speaking to his employer that, yes, he was issued this firearm, which was interesting because what we decided to do at that point was to inspect how G4S Solutions was issuing firearms broadly. And there were tremendous holes in how they were doing it. So that led to another spin-off investigation. So, I mean, and I want to bring that up to show that it was really leave no stone unturned in pursuing how Mateen got the guns, what was his motivation, and things along those lines, where it seems that it absolutely was not the case when you refer to the fire. So, tragically, like I said, there's a lot of questions that still get kicked around about the standoff and why didn't the police go in there sooner? And I think now, because of what lessons learned with Pulse, with Parkland, with Uvalde, the current thing is no longer isolate and contain and try to negotiate. It's now run to the gunfire. So, I mean, look, it's apples and oranges to some degree, but as a younger cop, I responded to the Happy Land Social Club fire, which killed 87 people up here in the Bronx. It was an incident where a coat check girl spurned a guy who was upset, went down the street, got a gallon of gas and a book of matches and lit the place on fire. And the victims, mostly 14 to 17-year-olds, perished because they were trapped in this inferno. And I remember looking at the crime scene for Pulse Nightclub after, again, it was secured and whatnot, and kind of feeling the same way, that these poor people were trapped in this building, slain. They had nowhere to run, just like those kids from the Happy Land Social Club fire had nowhere to run. So it affected me pretty deeply, responding to that scene and working on the case. But I'm proud to have been able to at least contribute to help find out what happened and to be part of, the investigation, because I think it's important. It's important that the people of this country know exactly what happened so that you can expose the hate, but also point out what could be done better next time.
Definitely. And I think we've talked a lot about how the kind of community was affected in New Orleans after the upstairs lounge fire. But Robert, could you give us a little bit of an insight on how both the LGBTQ plus community in Orlando and the Orlando community at large were affected by the Pulse nightclub shooting?
Sure. To the best of my understanding, and I think this isn't my realm of history, but that what I experienced from writing this book and tracking this event closely is that there was overwhelming grief that was citywide. The city was almost brought to in some cases a standstill by the the degree of shock at processing what had just occurred, what had just been perpetrated. Orlando mayor, I remember Buddy Dyer, rushed to the scene with emergency workers to comfort survivors. The media was there to cover the tragedy, but in many cases they were much more sensitive, when thinking about how do we approach or feature survivors of the tragedy, there was much larger amount of consideration thinking about the trauma and mental health effects for individuals who did survive. There was a massive amount of concern about the individuals who suffered grievous physical injuries, about their fates in hospital systems, the Pulse site became a spontaneous sort of memorial outside of it for blocks, flowers. You couldn't miss that something had happened in this place. And Florida Governor Rick Scott, then Florida Governor Rick Scott, offered condolences to families. Staunch conservative, that wasn't even a question, very quickly offered condolences to families. A lot of emergency response and federal money went to the emergency response. President Barack Obama made a statement. He went on television and made a statement that easily 4 decades before could have applied to the destruction of the upstairs lounge in New Orleans. But he said, I'll read it because I found it very moving. He said, "For so many people here who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, the Pulse Nightclub has always been a safe haven, a place to sing and dance, and most importantly, to be who you truly are. Sunday morning, that sanctuary was violated in the worst way imaginable." And then he directed federal flags to fly at half staff over buildings. And it was a not just, I would say, for Orlando, but it became a national moment, in many cases, a national moment of reckoning and concern. And a desire, there was an overwhelming desire, especially in a place like New Orleans that had suffered, as Officer Porcelli was saying, this isn't apples and oranges tragedy, but people who had suffered as any kind of event of anti-gay violence wanted to know what to do, how to help the people in Orlando. That was the sort of the national response. In New Orleans, the Superdome, they can light the stadium on the outside, and they lit it all the colors of the rainbow in honor of the Pulse Nightclub and in solidarity with the victims and survivors of the Pulse Nightclub shooting. And there were visible displays like that everywhere.
Absolutely. And I think that it really goes to show kind of the change in our society and our acceptance of the LGBTQ community and our support of the victims of the Pulse Nightclub shooting. But that law enforcement response is a very, very key thing as well. And the support of the public for the law enforcement officers to continue this investigation and make sure every stone doesn't go unturned, as Peter mentioned. And so I have one more question for you, Peter. So pulling from your experience in the law enforcement field, do you believe the response to Pulse helped to impact a broader shift towards a more proactive and informed approach to policing, particularly in relation to the safety of marginalized communities?
Yes, and I think law enforcement learns as it goes. And look, the thing I think that's important to remember is Sir Robert Peel, who's viewed as the father of modern policing, always said that the police are the community and the community is the police. And I think, times have changed. When I started with the NYPD, it was 90 to 95% white, mostly male. Now it's very diverse. I think you see that amongst many agencies. And among that diversity, it doesn't just come people of different colors. It comes people of different sexual preferences. So so I think that understanding also helps. So yeah, there's training, there's other things that go on, but now that you see more gay men and women in law enforcement, then law enforcement gets to realize, hey, these are our brothers and sisters. So they view people on the outside of the community with, I guess, in a more educated fashion than they did when it was them. You know what I mean? Now it's us, if that makes sense. I think that's important.
It definitely does. And it is important. And one of the things that I have said in a lot of our programs like this, especially in this last year, but in many years in the past as well, law enforcement agencies serve our communities best when they reflect the communities that they serve. Yes. And have individuals from different marginalized communities or just different areas of life within the diverse community that law enforcement is put in place to serve. And so I think, it's a very good way to help our officers come through and serve our communities in a way that's more educated because they're just experiencing it every day, which is a really great thing.
Could I add to that a little, Anna?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in New Orleans, some of the most prominent queer citizens are queer officers. Actually, the NOPD of today has an LGBT liaison task force, which has like basically a direct line to the NOPD superintendent, who is an outspoken ally of the local queer community. So that this again speaks to not just the complete pivot, where as y'all were saying, where something changes when it becomes us, not just studying them as a community, but the community is the queer community as part of the police force, and that's significant. But also the fact that how far society's come, where a group that was considered of a criminal class, committing arrestable offenses just for their very identity, now are officers of the court representing the law to the community. That's a big pivot.
Absolutely. And we're kind of to the point of our conversation where we're bringing both of these events and kind of the aftermath of these events together. In fact, one of the biggest things that I kind of wanted to point out as we were talking is the fact that in the immediate aftermath of the Pulse Nightclub shooting, we had the upstairs lounge fire kind of coming back into the media, or coming into the media really for the first time. For instance, there was a New York Times article that was published about kind of the upstairs lounge fire, and kind of talking about it as this event that you may not know about, but something like Pulse has happened before.
I remember a New York Times headline that says, before Orlando, there was New Orleans.
Yeah, it was something along those lines. And so we have these comparisons being drawn about these two events at the time when the Pulse Nightclub shooting is happening. And my first question here is going to go to Frank. In the decades after the upstairs lounge fire, the New Orleans Police Department has implemented changes in their training and implemented other initiatives to improve their relationship with the LGBTQ plus community. Could you elaborate on these efforts?
Sure. Well, they have instituted a lot of training. A lot of that was largely the result of political activists deliberately making an effort to underscore the importance of the police department becoming more sensitive. And I think that also had a lot to do with city hall politicians. One of the first really queer-friendly mayors here was a man named Sidney Bartholomew, and he was very instrumental in helping bring about some of those shifts in attitudes as well. But a lot of it, I think, is just an organic result of this major paradigm shift that society's undergone in the last couple of generations with regard to public attitudes toward queerness.
Absolutely. And Peter, just to really talk about this from the experience of someone who's been through law enforcement training, and you began your career with the NYPD, which is where Stonewall happened. So, which is obviously another event that's at the crossroads of LGBTQ and law enforcement history. But you've mentioned before that at the beginning of your career, you were already receiving training on the job to inform officers on how to interact with marginalized groups within your community.
Yes.
How important is it that officers around the country receive this kind of training and understand the specific needs of groups like the gay community within their jurisdictions?
Well, it's incredibly important. And look, like I said earlier, first of all, Stonewall was in some of the training. That specific incident, we learned about it in the academy. You sat there, you were instructed about what happened there. You heard from people who were directly involved in that incident, who came and spoke to us. So you had a pretty good understanding. But, more broadly, like I said, it's interesting. In the big cities, I think there's a lot more acceptance because people have exposure to different groups. I've worked in other parts of the country where people don't have that sort of awareness because they're isolated, and some of it's geographic in nature. So I think that in those instances, training is important because when the training helps you to understand. Some folks fear the unknown. If they've never been exposed to people who are different from them, they judge, and it's not certainly appropriate. But I think that in some ways it's just a defense mechanism, perhaps human nature. I don't know. But I worked with ATF agents when I started my career who were in parts of the country where they didn't see African Americans very often, and they didn't understand the Black culture. So I do think that, awareness is important, and it's something that comes through training when you don't have that abundance of people from the community around you. That's how you find out about who they are, what they are. And it's most important to understand that they're people. They're us.
Mhm.
It's no longer them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Robert, to kind of bring this full circle, why do you think it took another tragic event in the gay community, like the Pulse Nightclub shooting, for the story of the upstairs lounge fire to finally be recognized by a wider audience?
That's a big question. Well, I think by and large, many Americans, I think a lot of us are in denial about the degree to which we exist in the stream of history and the way that historical currents move through our life in the present day. I think that's a disempowering notion for some people, especially some people who perhaps were underserved in their school curricula, where they don't learn a lot of American history, where one starts to think basically, and this is a natural human phenomenon, the world started the day I was born, and my choices affect my present day now, as opposed to many things we experience are a byproduct of ripples that occurred decades, if not centuries ago. We are tied together as human beings in the great historical American story. So there's that. And then I also think there's a lot of inertia within the scope of American patriotism, because I think a lot of us aspire to be patriotic, and we do love this country. And there's this idea, there's this inertia to believing negative stories about, because we've been, there's a segment of our society that says that if you learn this history, basically you're teaching yourself to hate America. I disagree. I think you can learn about these historic tragedies, and you can find heroes, and you can find people that are of incredible ideals who are worth emulating and knowing. It's kind of like saying, don't learn about the civil rights movement, because why? You don't know Martin Luther King and the greatest American of the 20th century? I mean, you should learn him because he's admirable. And so I think that within that context, that there is a real reticence to believe that sort of negative human rights trends could exist in present day America until an earth-shattering moment occurs. And you can see this in a lot of different rights issues, but oftentimes in the American public, it takes an earth-shattering moment. It takes a George Floyd, it takes a Trayvon Martin. Unfortunately, it takes a pulse for certain segments of American society to wake up and realize they can't just sit back, that part of being a citizen in this country is being a voice in civics and fighting for your rights and fighting for the rights on behalf of others. So that's why I think that it sometimes takes a present day contextualizing, earth-shattering event for people to even be willing to look back and think about, how the heck did we miss that back there? How the heck did we miss that?
Absolutely. And I think that's a good segue into kind of my final question that I have for all of you. Because one of the things that we really talked about in context of the upstairs lounge was the fact that at the time, being homosexual in New Orleans was technically illegal. And there were laws against homosexual relationships and homosexuality. And it left kind of the gay community, when faced with a moment of emergency, as to, do they really have law enforcement to call upon? We're in an emergency. When we have an emergency, we're supposed to call the fire department, supposed to call the police. But if you're technically considered to be illegal, is that really a safe municipality to call? But today, our society is very different. That's not illegal anymore. Like, the police are supposed to be a resource that anyone can call in the time of emergency. But as you've mentioned, the trans community, especially right now, is in kind of this very precarious situation that's been placed upon them. So I guess my question for all of you would be, what can law enforcement and even other municipal agencies do to ensure that if tragedy strikes within their local LGBTQ plus communities, that the members of those communities can feel empowered to reach out for help?
I would hope that's not still a problem throughout the country. I'm sure in some small pockets it is. Look, the one thing that concerns me, and Frank touched on a little bit, is media. There's hard left media, there's hard right media, and I think they both don't do us a very good service because they pull us in different directions, and they make it them again, where we're us. They try to make us them. Two different opposing groups. I think most Americans would be better served to just better understand their people, to tune out the media, to do their own research. And look, I think one of the things that's a challenge for Americans, and I'll even talk about 9/11, is we forget. I'd love to see these politicians who show up at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum and talk about never forget, never forget. And then when you look at their actions, very often, and this is both sides, their actions show that they have forgotten. So I think it's incumbent on the people to make sure that we're electing the right people, putting them in office, and that we ensure that they don't forget, and that people understand that we are one community with different interests. Real interesting to learn about other people as opposed to demonizing them. And I think that in today, especially with social media, where we have some people who are just so in their own world, they don't pay attention to what's going on around them. They don't care about their fellow person. It's all about them. It's all about getting that social media like. And in some instances, they'll say some of the most extreme, disgusting things just to generate content. So I think when people better understand each other, and law enforcement is, again, part of the community, I think we're heading in a better direction.
Bobby, you want to go next?
Sure. I echo everything that you just said. I feel like when tragedy strikes, the best way for law enforcement to be able to be present in a positive context is to already have established a presence in that community. The work sort of happens beforehand, where pivotal trust relationships are established such that representatives of that community can reach out to the trusted representative in law enforcement, and you have that initial connection, and then you can make progress from there. So I think that's pivotal. I also think, frankly, the LGBT community needs to feel, in general, in any place, trust in the law enforcement institution, which means that, and this is a very difficult concept to talk about, but code of blue, officer mistakes in the past or things like that happen that are unfortunate need to be handled and processed in a transparent way in the public. And even stuff from decades past can be looked at in a sort of debrief, or what do we know now that we didn't know then, sort of thing. And that involves difficult conversations in and among law enforcement officers. And I know it's hard. It's like it's a job where you've got to be excellent every day. And the expectations for the public is difficult, and inevitably someone's going to make a mistake, and that shouldn't necessarily always mean catastrophic things for that person's life in this era where stuff can spin way out of control in social media. But the idea of transparency among officers, and the idea that that leads to a level of community trust where the queer community believes the officers, right, are engaging in a good faith manner, and the officers also trust the queer community, right, and through established ties. That's a really difficult thing to talk about. Nobody in policing at all likes the term internal affairs. No one likes any of these things like that. But I think that the legacy of those things, when they're not handled properly over years and decades, become part of this rumor mill in the queer community that leads to distrust, which can lead to a breakdown in these emergency moments. So you asked the question, and I know that this is for the Law Enforcement Museum, and I can't believe I'm even bringing this up. But and I have friends who are officers, queer officers and non-queer officers, and I'm not anti-cop. I know, and I understand that it's one of the most difficult jobs, but that's something that I think needs to be addressed and discussed too as a pivotal part of maintaining the trust between the two constituencies.
Definitely. It's all about, and a lot of what we try to do with our programming here, kind of, as you mentioned, is, I mean, we're bringing up the upstairs lounge fire investigation today, which was barely an investigation. And really talking about, you know, it's up to the way that our communities move forward, the way that policing kind of evolves with our evolving communities is by addressing the things that happened in the past, and kind of that general historical idea of, if we don't learn from our mistakes, we're doomed to repeat them. So kind of taking that hard look at these things that have happened in the past and being able to do that. We're doing it on kind of this very historical level, but it's also up to our communities to take a look at their own histories and what has happened in their communities in the past and what we want to be like moving forward. That's how we all have better law and order, how we all have just better ways of life throughout our society across the country. So I think it's a very good thing to bring up. No worries, not at all. And Frank, any final thoughts from you?
I would just encourage everyone to vote. If you're not registered to vote, go register. And if you are registered to vote, show up and vote.
Yes, being definitely very true. Being involved in your community, being involved in the people who are in leadership in your community is certainly the greatest first step that we all can take. And that is proved by both of these events as well, I think, so that we've discussed today. So with all of that, I'd like to thank all three of you for being here today and having this difficult but very timely and incredibly important conversation. We're recording this on the second day of Pride Month, so we've got a whole month to really sit with this conversation and really learn from it. And I think it's, I'm always impressed, and I feel like I learn quite a bit when I talk to any of you. So I'm very glad to have had all of us here today. I hope our listeners, our viewers can say the same. And we hope that we'll see you all again soon for our next program. So thank you all so much.
We hope you enjoyed tonight's program, Tragedy and Transformation, Law Enforcement Response to Hate Crime Events. I would like to extend my thanks to our panelists for offering their expertise and insight during this critical discussion. Additionally, I would like to thank Target for sponsoring tonight's program. The National Law Enforcement Museum is committed to telling the stories of American law enforcement. With your support, programs like this are possible, and we appreciate that you took the time to join us. Thank you, and stay safe.